So this is the map I want to show you. I just need to get that stuff out of here so I can get the whole picture, because there's the bottom part has the years. Here we go. So you have the bottom has the years going backwards. So from left to right, it starts at 850 BC, 825, 800, 775, 750. So every 25 years, I have a mark. Now, the bottom, the column in light green is Israel. That's the north kingdom. The one on top of it is Judah, the southern kingdom, the line of David. They both end with the fall of their capital. So the fall of Samaria ends the kingdom of Israel. The fall of Jerusalem ends the, that's a shadow of the box where I put that thing. It shouldn't be there, but I'm talking about the fall of Samaria would be the blue line where Hoshea, the king, is. The fall of Samaria is this blue line, if you can highlight it, this one. That's the fall of Samaria by this king. By the way, kingdom of Israel will never come back. It was gone forever. And this was around 720. It might be a mistake here, 720 BC. The fall of Jerusalem was in the late 5th or the early 5th century, around 590 or 585. So this is a need to be shifted a little bit to the right. But then you see on top, if you can see the groups, if you go back to up to the groups of prophets, blue is major prophets. The orange or the red is minor prophets. They are the minor prophets. So if you count the minor prophets on top, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you have 7 and 5, which makes 12. But then the major prophets, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel, and there is also the lamentation of Jeremiah. So you have the 4 major prophets, if you can say 4, and the 12 minor prophets. What will decide their content is the timing. So you have those 5. Now you're going to have to mix them together to get the timing of the groups. The time of Jonah, Joel, Amos, Hosea, Micah, Isaiah is all in this area here between 825 all the way to 750 or 725. They end up a little bit later, actually. And we call this group is the group of prophets that monitored or worked during the Assyrian crisis. This is at the time when Assyria was very aggressive, taking over places and expanding. They were witnessing the expansionist strategies and plans of Assyria. The other group, which is Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Obadiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel, they were in the witnesses of the Babylonian crisis when Babylon was in power and had already conquered Assyria and about to come and take the land by force. And it is Babylon, so Assyria is responsible for the ending of Israel and the fall of Samaria, its capital, while Babylonia is the responsible party in the fall of Jerusalem and the ending of the reign of the line of David. What about the last 3? Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. These are, we call them the great 3, the great assembly. Why? They end the prophetic career of Israel. There were no prophets after that. In the mind of the Jews, there's no more prophets. This is it. By the last one, Malachi, prophecy ended, ceased to exist from Israel. They were the one to witness the return and the rebuilding of the temple and the city. So you have 3 groups again. The first group is Assyrian Crisis group, 8th century prophets. Babylonian Crisis group, and they were the group writing and documenting and prophesying and working around the Babylonian crisis. And this is from the mid-7th to the mid-6th centuries BC. When I say mid-7th, is it 500s, 600s? Mid-6th century. Is it 500s or 600s? 500s, right? So when you say 8th century, what are you looking at? 700s or 800s? 700s, okay? So this is something in summary to tell you about it. Now let's go and study those groups, not in great detail, but have a big idea. So when you look at something like Nahum, and you say, what would Nahum be talking about? Nahum would be talking about the approaching Babylonian threat. You talk about Amos, who was a very humble man, was up in Samaria, going out of his land from Judah, going up to the capital of Israel, the north kingdom. It's not his people, it's actually their enemies in a way. And he's talking to the king and shouting in the streets. He was a very, very poor, uneducated person who got sent from Judah to Samaria and sitting, looking at palaces made with big stones and ivory. People talk about the ivory palaces in Samaria. He talks about it. And why would he do that? Why would he go up in that time, especially in the time of King Hosea? And he speaks in the time of the king to Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II and said, what would he say to the king? Why would he be sent up to this place? What was Hosea talking to in the time of Hosea? Why would Isaiah in the time of Ahaz give a warning to the king about not being afraid of Syria and Israel? Let's go and look into this, and then I will give you some examples so you really understand, and I'm hoping that you will understand the prophets better after today. Go back to our document. So who were the prophets during the time of the reign of the kings? Which empires and rulers ruled during the time of the kings? So we're in the same place. We said 4 periods: the early monarchical period, which is 11th through 9th centuries. I didn't have that in the graph. We don't have it in that little drawing. The second group is the Assyrian Crisis group in the 8th century. The third group is the Babylonian Crisis group, late 7th through early 6th centuries. The post-exilic restoration, mid-6th through mid-5th centuries. Let's start with the first group, the early monarchical period, 11th through 9th century. This will be beginning at the time of David. They're talking about Samuel here is one of them. Because we said generally, remember the times, I said, how many years roughly, rounded figure, between Abraham and Christ? 2,000. Moses to Christ, 1,500. David to Christ, you follow me? Are you following what I'm doing? It's 500 years each. Abraham to Christ, 2,000. 500 years later comes Moses. 500 years come David. 500 years come the exile. And then 500 years come Christ. So you have Abraham to Moses 500 years, Moses to David 500 years, David to the exile 500 years. So when I say 1,000 years, so that your mind, you can make these connections if you want. 1,100 years before Christ, who do you expect to be in power? Saul, in the time of Saul, before David even, right? Even maybe a little bit even toward the judges. So you're talking about Samuel. So Samuel is part of this group, the early monarchical. We call them early monarchical because they started with the beginning of the reign of the kings. So they're early monarchical. No, monarchy is, monarchy means the leader of the one, means it's not democracy. Monarchy means the leader of the king, the leadership of the king. So in the earliest period, prophets may have been local or itinerant. You know what an itinerant means? It's a hard English, maybe it's not very commonly used. What itinerant mean? Wandering. Itinerant mean nomadic, wandering. They don't have a place. They'll be going from one place to another. So the prophets were local or wandering people. They either staying in one place like Samuel or wandering, going from one place to another. Holy men and women. They were not only men, the prophets were also women. You hear about Deborah, she was a judge and she was a prophetess. They were revered for their special religious powers and who might be consulted for a variety of private inquiries. Why? Somebody lost their donkeys. You saw that. They go to the prophet. He's very useful. The prophet is useful. He can find us the lost stuff. Locating lost property, I said in the case of Saul, to learning whether a sick child will live or die. And this was Elijah, right? Elijah and Elisha, they were consulted. Will my child live or will he die? So I don't want to be in that suspense. Some lived in prophetic communities which cultivated ecstatic forms of religious experience. You talk about Saul when he went with the prophets, the group of prophets, the community of prophets, and started to pray and praise and go into ecstasy. They call them the ecstatic prophets. They were called sons of the prophets in the sense of members of prophetic guilds. They had like a club, prophetic club. Prophets also had the public function of declaring God's will concerning whether the people should go to war or not. And we saw this in the time of David and King Saul. He would go to the prophet to tell him, should I go fight or not? The emergence of monarchy in ancient Israel may have changed aspects of the prophet's role. Prophets appear as king makers and king breakers. They make and break the kings. That's very tough, right? They announce that God has designated an individual to become a king, so they make a king, or has rejected a reigning king, and they break a king, like what happened with Saul. So that very clearly, God declared that David should be the king, and Saul should not anymore be a king. Though prophets continued their role in advising about matters of war, they also served as critics of the kings. Kings hated them, because the kings will feel like he's a child, and the prophet is actually controlling him. They hated them, they didn't like them, except very few kings who were really righteous, and they had the mind to go after what God wants. And they said, I don't care what happens. Like David, for example. David didn't care what would happen to him. He cared what would God want from him. The consolidation of royal power and the foreign religious practices, that's the problem now. Sometimes kings like Solomon, I'm sure Solomon had a lot of problems with Nathan. I'm sure the relationship was like walking on eggshells. Why? Solomon said, I need to use my human wisdom. God give me wisdom. I'm going to waste it. I'm going to do that so I can help the country. I don't want to go into wars. Wars spend a lot of money and energy and time. I'm going to make peace. So he said, how am I going to go make peace? The best strategy of making peace in those days is to marry into the other royal family. So you marry a princess or you marry a prince, you make peace with it automatically, because no king will go fight against his grandchildren. No king will have that in their mind. So the consolidation of royal power and foreign religious practices introduced through royal marriages often threatened older tribal institutions and values. So when Solomon goes to marry the daughter of Pharaoh, she would not come unless she would bring her own gods with her. He would marry the daughter of Sidon, the king of Sidon. She would bring the Baal with her, and she would set up her own statues and own idols and own religious worship. And they would bring also priests with them to establish that worship. So Solomon had introduced into Judah a lot of religious practices that was not orthodox from the Jewish perspective. He actually ended up breaking a lot of the commandments that God had said not to do. So the conflict between Elijah the prophet and Ahab and Jezebel was the highest, actually. The biggest. That you want an example of a conflict between prophet and king, it will be King Ahab and Jezebel and Elijah. They went at the throat of each other. Especially the woman, Jezebel, wanted to kill Elijah big time. Elijah, killed her 400 prophets. She brought to Israel 400 prophets to worship Baal from her country. And she made a big shrines for Baal and big temples for Baal. The king and queen illustrates these tensions between prophets and kings. By the end of this period, the first period, which we call the early monarchical prophets, the Assyrian Empire was in decline, which led to a period of prosperity. And I want you to focus on this because this is the subject of a big group of prophets. This specific piece of history. Why? Assyrian Empire got so big, became like a huge animal, and now started to be weak and not powerful anymore, which they didn't care to collect taxes from their vassal kings. Vassal means the small kingdoms that belongs to the big empire. So the empire says, we'll protect you, we'll do, they were they call them the thugs of history. The big empires would collect a lot of money and do little to protect their little kingdoms. They were thugs. Just exercise a lot of bullying because of their huge size. So they kept all the small kingdoms very weak. How they did that? By collecting huge taxes. All the kingdoms felt like they were suffocated. Once Assyria got sick and started to be weak, what happened? They started to flourish. They started to come back and feel prosperity. There's money in the country. The rich, as usual, got richer, and the poor, you get more money. People started to abuse the poor and to build. They said, we have money now. Our money is not going out to Assyria. Let's build palaces. Get me all the poor people in the country. We'll have them work for free. Well, at the end of the day, they give them a little bit of food. That's why you hear somebody like Amos going up to the north. And I'm going to tell you what happened, because he's in the time of Jeroboam II, especially, and Hosea. History says in the time of Jeroboam II and Hosea, the kingdom was at its highest economically. They were very rich country, especially Israel, where Jeroboam II was a ruler. So their contemporary prophets, Amos and Hosea, especially those two, condemned the lack of social justice in their time. They were just blowing in their faces. You cannot do, they're building what he called it, Amos called it the ivory palaces. You hear about it in the writing of Amos, if you want to go and read it. He said, you're building ivory palaces on the expense of the blood of your poor people. That cannot be. The Lord sees it and he will condemn you for it. So you would read, and we read this in the Holy Week, actually. There's a lot of that in the Holy Week about this unjust spending on the expense of the poor. The second group comes, there is, at the time when Assyria started to wake up again and pick up the missing pieces from the empire. And this is toward the 8th century. So Assyria started strong, got weaker, and then what? Picked up again and became strong. And this is the 8th century, 700s BC. Prophecy appears to have undergone a dramatic change during the 8th century, although this impression may be affected by the change in the nature of the sources of information. Maybe the history itself is not recorded correctly, but the Bible speaks about this as very special time. From the 8th century onward, collections of prophetic oracles are preserved, yet with the exception of Jeremiah, few extended narratives about prophets exist. It does appear, we don't know exactly the stories of the prophets themselves, but we have their work. That's what this says. It does appear, however, that in this period, prophets began to function less as private counselors and critics of kings, and more as public figures who influenced opinion through their pronouncements in the temple courts. They didn't just speak to the king. They didn't wait for people to come and give them a little bit of money to find lost stuff or to find out if they're going to win in the war or not, or all that stuff that they used to do as a private prophet. But they used to go to the temple and start speaking out. And in other public places, prophets of the 8th century, Amos, again, we talked about that, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, interpreted international affairs, critiqued complacent religious practices, and condemned the abuses of social justice that I spoke about. Accompanied the increasing urbanization and centralization of state power characteristics of the 8th century. There will be big cities and rich people. Like I told you, they got some money and they wanted to build big houses and live in that big city. They don't want to live in the country anymore. The prophetic careers of Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah took place in the shadow of the expansionist Assyrian Empire, which eventually put an end to the northern kingdom of Israel. and subjected Judah to a condition of vassalage, means they put pressure on Judah to pay back the taxes that they had not paid for a while. They interpreted these events, however, in terms of judgment of the Lord, not simply as the success of powerful Assyrian Empire. They said, if you were godly, no power on earth would have touched you. That's what all of them would say. And Isaiah is going to say it, especially to Ahaz. You'll see that. This perspective allowed Isaiah, for example, to anticipate the ultimate downfall of Assyria because of its overweening arrogance. They said at the end, this Assyrian Empire itself, because of its feeling that it's doing this by its own hand, not God is using it, will fall itself. So this is the 8th century, what we call the Assyrian Crisis. So what happened in this? When Assyria got a little bit bigger, started threatening all the kings of the area, especially the small kingdoms. So Syria, Israel, and Judah. These are the 3 that we're concerned with. Syria, there is Assyria, the empire, and Syria is a little kingdom. Syria went to Israel and said, let us join arms and ask your brother Judah to join us, and we'll make a bigger, because this is an empire, we're going to fight an empire, make a bigger army and fight Assyria, so they don't put us back into the subjection. Judah said, Isaiah told him, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do that. Ahaz was at the time. So when Ahaz thought about it, he thought about it for his own purpose and said, I'm not going to fight Assyria. If Assyria win the war, what will happen to me? He was very scared. But he was scared of the 2 kings. They were actually bigger than him. So Isaiah goes to him and said, do not be afraid of them. They're not going to come to you. They're not going to touch you. In fact, those kingdoms will end very soon. He said this. He said, ask a sign from God. He told Ahaz, chapter 7 in Isaiah. And Ahaz says, I'm not going to ask. I'm not going to tempt the Lord. He's pretending not to tempt the Lord. He doesn't believe. So Isaiah said to him, okay, if you don't believe, the Lord will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will be with a child, and you will call his name Emmanuel. Because before that child knows how to differentiate between good and evil, these 2 kingdoms will have no king. They will be done. Means, when does a child become able to differentiate between wrong and right? 3 years, 4 years? He said in 4 years. And this is what happened. And the time Ahaz had died and his son Hezekiah came, Assyria came with a huge army, completely wiped Syria and Israel. They don't exist anymore. The Syrian that came after that were not from the same race. And Israel was wiped, not to rise again, ever. So what he was afraid of, Isaiah told him, don't be afraid, they're not going to have it. But then not only that, but Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, the emperor, went with his army all the way to the doors of Judah, besieged Jerusalem, about to choke it to death. And he started yelling. He had his army leader yelling at the people in Hebrew, because at the time, the people in Israel used to speak Hebrew, and said to them, there's no God who's going to protect you from me, Sennacherib. I know your God, that you're depending on him. And he started blaspheming. And he sent them letters. So Isaiah took the letters and put them on the altar. And what happened? At the same night, something happened. And they describe it as the angel of the Lord. The army of Sennacherib started killing each other. For some reason, nobody knows. And then Sennacherib was told that your army is in big chaos around Jerusalem. They don't know what's going on. And then they went back to him. Then after that, maybe a year or 2, he was killed by his own 2 sons. So what Isaiah had predicted and prophesied happened. This is the Assyrian crisis. So one kingdom was completely wiped out, not to return. That's Israel. Judah, for 2 kingdoms, Israel and Syria. And Judah remained and got protected from the